Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Tommy Bayer, co-founder of the Aphantasia Network. And with me today, I have Paulo Bartolomeo from the Paris Brain Institute, who's here to talk about mental imagery and all the great work that they're doing there in Paris. So without any further ado, Paulo, thank you for joining me today.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Let's get started, Paulo. I'd love to hear a little bit about you and your background and how you got interested in mental imagery.
So I'm a neurologist by training, and I studied in Rome. And at that time, more than 30 years ago, actually, during my residency in neurology in Rome, I studied representational or imaginal neglect. These are patients, usually with hemisphere strokes, who do not pay attention to what happens on the left of their space. And so bump into objects on the left. They don't eat from the left part of their plate or something, things like that. And some of these patients actually do not pay attention to the left part of their mental images. If you ask some of them, not all of them, if you ask them to describe from memory a well-known place, the first description was from Milanese patients who were asked to describe the Piazza del Duomo, the square of the cathedral in Milan, which is very well known by all Milanese people. And they forgot to mention all the left-sided details from memory. So the conclusion at the time was that neglect was the loss of the left part of a mental representation of space. Now, in Rome, I was able to show with my coworkers by asking Roman patients to describe Roman piazzas that actually this couldn't be the case because only a minority of patients with visual spatial neglect also have neglect in their visual mental imagery, only about a third of them. So it cannot be the explanation of visual spatial neglect. But the phenomenon remains in a minority of patients, and it defies at least our explanations. We still don't know why exactly some patients lose the possibility to describe the left part of their mental images.
And these would have been things that they were familiar with before the injury or the stroke that caused this difference. And those images, those memories should still be intact.
This is shown by the control experiment that was performed in Milan, for example, because the researchers in Milan, they asked to describe the same place, the Piazza del Duomo, but from the opposite perspective. So patients had to imagine, for example, to exit the cathedral and to describe the piazza, and then to enable this patient to describe what they described before, but now they forgot to describe what they had described before, the former right part, which was now the left part of their mental image.
So it shows that the information, the memory is still present, but not perceptible.
Exactly. Information is there, but it is not accessed in a fashion to permit the explicit, at least, description.
Very fascinating series of cases. How did you then get from Rome to your work now at the Paris Brain Institute? What do you do there?
Yes, at the end of my PhD in Rome, there was an international European fellowship available, and my mentor proposed it to me to come to Paris. And I came to Paris exactly 30 years ago now, and here I am. Then in Paris, I saw another fascinating neurological patient who also sparked my interest in visual mental imagery. And she was a patient who had the misfortune of having two strokes in almost symmetrical parts of the brain, in the lower part of the brain, along the pathways between early vision and high-level vision, between the occipital and the temporal lobe of the brain. And this patient, of course, had enormous visual problems. She couldn't recognize objects. She had agnosia. She couldn't recognize colors. She had achromatosia. She saw the world in shades of gray because of these lesions. She couldn't recognize people. She had what we call prosopagnosia. She couldn't recognize people by their face visually. And she couldn't read anymore. She had alexia. But despite all these deficits, she had perfectly preserved visual mental imagery for these same items. So if I ask, she couldn't see cherries and strawberries, at least the color of cherries and strawberries. But when I asked her which red is darker between cherries and strawberries, she could very well picture cherries and strawberry, visualize cherries and strawberries in her head. She told me that she could see very clearly in her mind cherries and strawberries, and she was perfectly able to answer this kind of questions. And this was the first time I doubted the dominant model of visual mental imagery, which is, even now, it is probably the dominant model, which says that to visualize things, you need to use your primary visual cortex. Cannot be true because in this patient, we know that her primary visual cortex was disconnected from more anterior stages of processing, so that she could not recognize by sight objects or faces and so on. But her visual mental imagery was perfect. She must have used different brain structures than the primary visual cortex to visualize her mental images.
And this goes to that core mental imagery debate. I think it's been going on for kind of a long time. Do you mind, for those new to the subject, summarizing what is the mental imagery debate and how this case kind of plays into it?
Historically, it was mainly the debate between Stephen Kosslyn, psychologist. Now he's retired, but he was an eminent psychologist at Harvard University, who said that mental images are built in the brain, exactly real visual images, starting from V1. Actually, V1 is the primary visual cortex. And actually, it is this quasi-visual processing which gives visual mental images their visual character. On the other hand, there was this other psychologist, Pylyshyn, who said that actually everything in the brain is symbolic, it's not pictorial. So that there must be some propositional, symbolic, non-pictorial code, which is at the basis of visual mental images, as it is at the basis of language, of memory, and of every other cognitive process. This was the big debate during the last century. Then there was some neuroimaging evidence suggesting a role for primary visual cortex or visual cortex in general in visual mental imagery, which went more towards Kosslyn's model. However, as I said before, the patient I studied, and many other patients, actually, neurological patients, in the literature provide causal evidence that this cannot be true, at least in a literal way. And here in Paris, we performed first a meta-analysis of all fMRI studies or neuroimaging studies which had been done on visual mental imagery. And then we performed our own visual mental imagery fMRI study by using ultra-high field fMRI, 70 fMRI, a technique with unmatched resolution to visualize the living human brain. And we saw that actually early visual cortex is not used at all during this kind of tests, the tests of visual mental imagery. This does not mean that Pylyshyn was completely right in saying that there is nothing visual in visual mental imagery, because we did see high-level visual regions, more anterior in the temporal lobe, the floor of the brain, let's say, in the anterior part, which were activated by this kind of questions, which red is darker between strawberries and cherries, or questions in general about the physical, the visual appearance of objects. So there is something visual, but it is not early vision. It is high-level late vision, which is implicated in visual mental imagery.
It's very interesting. And questions like this, which is a deeper shade of red, the cherry or the strawberry, there's similar questions like what's a deeper shade of green, the blade of grass or the evergreen tree. Aphantasics can answer these questions quite straightforward way. We met in Paris I think in November, and I was speaking with some of your colleagues there. We had a little bit of a discussion about how are these types of questions answered. And for some of the visualizers we were speaking to, they talked about how first they visualize the image and then they choose which one is the deeper shade. But for us with no image, or no conscious image at least, it doesn't seem like it's a comparison. It's more like an inherent knowledge. And so how do we square these things, and how does this fit into our understanding of how visualization occurs in the brain?
You're absolutely right. It's a great question, and it remains a mystery for the moment, but we don't know exactly. One thing that we were actually surprised to find that people with aphantasia could answer easily this kind of questions. And this is a big difference between, let's say, congenital aphantasia and neurological aphantasia, because there are patients also with lesions more anterior in the temporal lobe who can lose their abilities of visual mental imagery as a consequence of their stroke, especially in the left temporal lobe. And these patients, they claim not to be able to visualize things anymore since their strokes, but they cannot answer this kind of questions. They do not know. And so this is a very important difference between congenital, I would say, aphantasia, which is not a disease, absolutely. It's just a normal variation, probably, variation in the normal functioning of the brain, and lesion and neurological aphantasia, lesion-based aphantasia, where there is a clear deficit.
This gets to the next question then, is something like neurological aphantasia. This is based on some damage in the brain. Would cases like this we'd see more as something that maybe needs to be cured or needs to be fixed because they haven't? And is this because there is brain damage, or is it because maybe they haven't learned the strategies or the techniques that a congenital case will have learned? Why are there such differences in these two cases? Is it like the nurture and the adaptability, or is it something else going on?
Fortunately, I don't know the answer, a precise answer to this question. It is what we are trying to work about here in Paris and elsewhere in other labs as well. One important thing that we found is that when we put aphantasic individuals in the 70 fMRI machine, while they were trying to visualize or trying to answer this kind of questions on the visual appearance of objects, we saw exactly, or more or less exactly, the same brain network being activated as in typical imagers. The only difference we saw was in the coordination between activation patterns. There is a kind of analysis we do in fMRI, which is called functional connectivity, which is simply trying to assess the temporal patterns of activation of different regions to see whether they activate together or they deactivate together. And what we saw is that in typical imagers, frontoparietal networks high in the brain, which are important for working memory and for attention, they tend to activate together. Their activation is temporally correlated with the activation of these high-level visual areas in the floor of the brain, especially left temporal cortex. In aphantasic individuals, we saw the same activations, frontoparietal plus temporal on the floor of the brain, but they were apparently not correlated temporally, as if, I don't know actually how to interpret this, but it was very clear as a result. As if perhaps one possibility is that aphantasic individuals use less efficiently perhaps their attentional network to read out activity in high-level visual cortex. so that this activity, it is there, it can access information, but it doesn't reach a conscious level of processing. So this is a possibility, but we don't know yet whether it's true or not.
I think a very different case from the imaginal neglect type of cases where they don't experience half of the image.
Could have some analogies in the sense that we tend to think we don't have a mechanistic explanation of imaginal neglect yet. It's still a mystery, but the possibility could be that these patients who have lesions in these attentional networks in the right hemisphere, parietal lesions in the right hemisphere, perhaps they cannot access information about the left part of their visual mental images. Once again, information is there.
Change the perspective.
But they cannot access it from a determined perspective. It could be.
Does it always seem to be on that one side of the experience, on the one side of their perceptual experience?
In imaginal neglect, it's always on one side. And curiously, it seems to be always the left side after right hemisphere damage. You can have a few cases. So neglect spatial neglect is especially frequent and severe for the left space after right hemisphere damage. But in a few cases, in about 10% of patients with the left hemisphere damage, you can find signs of right-sided neglect. Now, there are virtually no cases of representational or imaginal neglect after left brain damage. For some reasons, which we don't know yet, imaginal neglect seems to be always after right hemisphere damage and for the left part of imagined space.
Have you ever come across congenital cases of imaginal neglect, or is it always based on some kind of damage or lesion?
No, I must say it's a relatively rare condition. It's not very easy to study. Something I've always thought, but I was never able to test this hypothesis empirically, is that perhaps people with less vivid mental images, or people with aphantasia, for example, they would be less liable to show signs of imaginal neglect. Why do I say that? Because we know, at least for visuospatial neglect, the saliency of right-sided stimuli, non-neglected stimuli, is important in capturing patients' attention and making them unable to redirect attention towards the left. There is this effect which is very strong in visuospatial neglect. Perhaps there is something like that for imaginal neglect as well, where right-sided visual mental images are able to capture patient's attention so that the patient cannot go towards the left side of the visual mental images. Of course, if such mechanisms are at work, they would work only with very vivid mental images capable to capture patient's attention. But once again, this is pure speculation. We don't know exactly what happens.
Based on everything that we know so far about aphantasia and how it's represented in the brain, do you believe it's theoretically possible for aphantasics to experience imagery? We know that the same brain regions are active but not coordinating in the same way. Is it possible to change how those patterns coordinate?
So if it is a functional connectivity problem, then theoretically it is possible to influence brain connectivity. There are many TM, transcranial magnetic stimulation, non-invasive brain stimulation, or even drugs. They could influence brain connectivity in principle, or perhaps another funny way could be to use neurofeedback. So to try to influence, neurofeedback is when you try to influence your own brain activity based on a feedback. For example, we can record your electrical activity in the brain, or even in fMRI, we can see the activity in the brain and give you some feedback, a count bar which goes up or down, some visual feedback according to the modifications of your activity. And in that way, you could be able to change your brain activity by following the bar, by trying to do something, whatever it is in your mind, which makes the bar going up. So this could be theoretically something which can be tried with aphantasic individuals. For example, try to increase the connectivity, the functional connectivity, the temporal correlation between frontoparietal activation and fused end activity lower in the brain, and see whether this can perhaps bring some mental images to consciousness.
One of the things that we know is that it's not either aphantasia or visualization. It seems there's a spectrum of experience. Some people experience imagery very vividly, almost lifelike. Other people report very dim. Maybe they just see a little image. Why such variation in this kind of experience?
Probably it's a spectrum like most human activities and human cognitive abilities. Virtually everything we do or we think, that we can imagine a Gaussian distribution with an average, the center, and then an average which is probably most frequent, the most frequent situation, and then situations at the extremes which are less frequent. And this is a general law, I would say general law of nature, not only of human cognition, but probably it's true for human cognition as well.
Do we think something similar would be across all of the senses? Because we've been focused on visual mental imagery, but people do experience sensory imagination in auditory, gustatory, tactile, all of the kind of human senses. Do we know much about this?
Guys in your networks, you should be able to answer this question better than me, because no, really. There are some studies, I have no personal experience with this kind of studies, but I've seen some studies, or also personal descriptions of people saying, yes, I am aphantasic across all sensory modalities. I don't know whether this is your case or not, for example.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Others say, no, I cannot visualize, but I can imagine sounds very well. Probably it's not a homogeneous situation. But
and is that
to see really real epidemiological is not a good term because it's not a disease, but large-scale studies trying to better define this situation.
Because would this imply that there are maybe domain-specific and then more general kind of aspects of this sensory imagination? If some people can maybe not see visual mental imagery, but they can experience auditory, and then others have it across all the senses, there are a difference between domain and general.
This is certainly possible. And this also suggested, shifting to the neurological forms of aphantasia, there have been so-called dissociation described in the literature of patients who could not imagine, for example, we actually described one of such cases of a patient who became, after a stroke, unable to imagine the visual form of letters and words, but he could very well imagine all the other phases, colors, spatial relationships, and so on, the shape of objects. So there can be, at least in the neurological population, dissociation even for specific domains of visual mental imagery. Now, this is why we try to study, for the moment, 5 different domains of visual mental imagery, which are phases, colors, shapes of objects, letters, and spatial relationships. Because these 5 domains have been described as being dissociable in neurological patients, but probably there are more. For example, imagery of movement could be also a different domain.
And so even for those who visualize, there can be individual differences in different categories of visual mental imagery.
So in non-neurological populations, I don't think so. In our subjects, but we have a limited sample, of course, they were all at the more or less the same level, these 5 domains, same level of performance and of brain activation.
Where do you see the field evolving? What are some of the big questions in visual mental imagery, and how does aphantasia maybe assist in our understanding of what's happening how visual mental imagery arises?
One of the big debates, big issues now in neuroscience is the brain basis of consciousness, conscious experience. And I think with aphantasia, we are exactly there in the sense two individuals with the more or less same performance, same cognitive performance. They have very different subjective experiences. How is that possible? To me, this remains the big question of aphantasia in general, and perhaps aphantasia could be a window to understand why we all have different subjective experiences and perhaps how to modulate them.